In the early hours of the 13th of March 1964, a 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked and killed outside her apartment in Queens, New York. She was coming home from her job managing a bar, parking her car a short walk from her own front door, the kind of ordinary night that ends 1,000 different ways, almost all of them unremarkable. 2 weeks later, the New York Times ran a story that would outlive almost everyone who read it and would go on to shape how tens of millions of people understood crowds, cities, and each other for the rest of the 20th century. 38 witnesses, the headline said. 38 people who saw or heard the attack and did absolutely nothing. Not one called the police. The story became one of the most cited moments in the history of psychology. Proof, it seemed, of something genuinely disturbing about human nature. That a crowd doesn't make us safer. It makes us silent. For 60 years, that story has opened psychology textbooks, TED Talks, true crime documentaries, and more office safety trainings than anyone can count. Here's the problem. Nearly every detail that made it famous was wrong. Let's find out what actually happened that night and why the real science that came out of it, built on a false story, turned out to be genuinely, carefully, true anyway. The New York Times published its account on the 27th of March 1964, under the byline, Martin Gainsbourg, built on a number given to the paper's city editor, A.M. Rosenthal, in a conversation with police officials. 38 witnesses. It was never independently verified before it ran. The real events of that night were messier and far less theatrical. Genovese was attacked in 2 separate locations, minutes apart. During the first attack, a neighbor named Robert Moser opened his window and shouted, "Let that girl alone!" And the attacker, Winston Moseley, actually fled. Genovese, wounded, made her way toward the back of her building, out of view of the street she'd first been attacked on. Moseley returned later and found her again in a hidden stairwell, largely hidden from the windows that supposedly overlooked the entire attack. Most of the 38 turned out to be what researchers later called ear witnesses, not eyewitnesses. People who heard fragments, a scream in the night, muffled through closed windows and thick walls, and, in the confusion of 3 a.m., half asleep, assumed it was a drunken argument, a domestic dispute, a couple stumbling home from a bar, anything other than what it actually was. Only a small handful have ever been shown to have realized what was happening and hesitated, and even fewer did nothing at all once they understood. One neighbor, Carl Ross, cracked his door, saw the attack directly, and closed it again, calling a friend for advice before eventually raising the alarm. Another neighbor, Sophia Farrar, went down herself and held Genovese as she was dying. Some residents did call the police. 9/11 didn't exist yet, and reaching the right precinct wasn't always simple. In 2004, Times journalist Jim Reisenberger began publicly questioning the original account, revisiting the case 40 years later and finding the details didn't line up with what he uncovered. In 2007, psychologists Rachel Manning, Mark Levine, and Alan Collins published a detailed academic takedown in the journal American Psychologist, calling it, pointedly, The Parable of the 38 Witnesses, a title chosen deliberately, because a parable isn't judged by whether it happened. It's judged by whether the moral feels true. In 2015, Kitty's own brother, Bill Genovese, produced a documentary called The Witness, spending years tracking down the actual neighbors involved, determined to learn what had truly happened to his sister, partly because he'd enlisted to fight in Vietnam specifically, so he wouldn't become one of the people who watched and did nothing, only to spend decades later discovering that most of them never really existed the way the story claimed. The New York Times itself has since revisited its own 1964 reporting more than once, acknowledging that some of the story's most damning details were never substantiated at all. The number 38 doesn't hold up. The image of dozens of people calmly watching a woman die for half an hour doesn't hold up either. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The public outrage over that false story still did something real. It reached 2 young social psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latané, who were, by most accounts, skeptical of the simplest explanation being offered at the time, that New Yorkers specifically had simply become cold, uncaring, morally numb from city life. They found themselves asking a different, more testable question instead, one worth answering regardless of whether the Genovese case itself was accurately reported. Does the presence of other people actually change whether any one person helps? Not because people are worse in cities, but because of something more universal about how groups work. In 1968, they built an experiment to find out, disguised carefully enough that participants had no idea what was actually being measured. College students sat alone, in separate booths, believing they were part of a group discussion over an intercom about the difficulties of college life, a design specifically meant to prevent anyone from seeing each other's faces or knowing how many people were even really there. Partway through, one voice, secretly a recording, not a real participant at all, began to simulate a seizure, stammering, calling out for help, then falling silent. When participants believed they were the only other person listening, 85% went to get help, almost immediately, often before the recording had even finished. When they believed 4 other people were also listening, fewer than 1/3 did, and many took several minutes longer to act at all, some never acting before the experiment was ended for them. The following year, a second experiment, now known as the smoke-filled room study. Participants filled out a questionnaire, alone or alongside 2 other people, quietly told beforehand to ignore anything unusual, no matter what happened. Smoke began drifting into the room through a vent, thin at first, then thick enough to sting the eyes and blur the far wall. Alone, 75% of participants got up and reported it, usually within 2 minutes. Surrounded by 2 people calmly doing nothing, glancing at the smoke and simply shrugging, that number dropped to 10%. Even as the room grew genuinely hazy, genuinely hard to see across, with almost everyone privately uneasy and outwardly silent. Darley and Latané called the mechanism diffusion of responsibility, and it wasn't simply about not caring. When one person witnesses an emergency alone, all of the responsibility sits on them, undivided, impossible to hand off to anyone else. Add more witnesses, and that responsibility quietly splits apart, spread thin enough that everyone can plausibly assume someone else, somewhere in the group, is already handling it, or is better positioned to help than they are. A second mechanism compounds it pluralistic ignorance. In an ambiguous moment, before anyone is certain what's actually happening, people glance around for social cues, reading each other's faces, the way you'd read a room before speaking. If everyone else looks calm, each person concludes it mustn't be a real emergency, even while privately feeling uneasy underneath it. The group's outward calm becomes a kind of accidental performance, each person fooling everyone else into inaction, nobody lying, everybody still somehow wrong together. Later researchers, building on Darley and Latané's original work, broke the whole process into 5 separate steps a bystander has to clear, in strict order, before help ever actually arrives. Notice the event in the first place. Easy to miss if you're distracted, in a hurry, or simply looking the wrong way. Interpret it correctly as an emergency, rather than something ordinary, like 2 friends joking around, or a car backfiring. Assume personal responsibility for doing something about it, rather than assuming the dozen other people nearby already have it covered. Know, concretely, how to help, rather than freezing, because you're unsure what the right move even is. And finally, actually act on all of that, in the moment, not afterward, not once it's safe to have decided, in hindsight, what you would have done. A failure at any single step along that chain is enough to stop the whole process, regardless of how a person would answer if you simply asked them, calmly, whether they'd help a stranger in danger. None of this required the Genovese case to be true, as reported. The lab results held up on their own, replicated for decades afterward. But here's the twist inside the twist. More recent research has started complicating even that carefully replicated laboratory finding. In 2019, a team of researchers, led by Richard Philpott and Lasse Liebst, reviewed security camera footage from real public conflicts across multiple countries: the Netherlands, the UK, South Africa. Over 200 incidents, genuine, unstaged, unpredictable emergencies, captured by ordinary street cameras rather than built in a laboratory. Bystanders intervened in more than 90% of them, usually within the first minute, often multiple bystanders at once, stepping in to de-escalate, separate, or physically help. Not the chilling apathy the original headline promised. Not even the more modest, controlled effect Darley and Latané found in a lab decades earlier. Something closer to the opposite in the real world. Outside a controlled room, with real stakes and real strangers, most people, most of the time, actually do something, and having more bystanders present didn't reliably stop them. So the honest picture has 3 layers, not one. A famous story about 38 silent witnesses that was substantially untrue, built and printed faster than anyone bothered to check it. A real, replicated laboratory finding showing that groups genuinely can suppress individual action under specific, controlled conditions, confirmed across dozens of studies for over 50 years. And newer, real-world evidence suggesting that outside those controlled conditions, with real danger and real consequences, people intervene far more often than either the myth or the lab predicted. All 3 of those things are true at once, which is a much harder story to fit into a single textbook paragraph than the one that actually made it into most of them. Kitty Genovese was a real person. Not a parable, not a statistic, not a cautionary tale about apathy invented for her own murder. The number that made her death famous was wrong within days of being printed, and stayed wrong in classrooms, lecture halls, and safety trainings for 60 years anyway, because it was simpler, more dramatic, and more useful as a warning than the messier truth underneath it. The real lesson was never nobody would help you. It was that a headline can outlive its own facts for 6 decades, reprinted, cited, and taught, long after the reporter who wrote it and the editor who ran it were gone, while the actual science it accidentally inspired kept getting quietly more accurate, more careful, and more honest underneath it, the entire time, built by people who were simply trying to find out what was actually true, regardless of which version made the better story.